prevention. Thanks. So I'll just a couple minutes for you all to know like what our overall program does, and then they're going to tell you a little bit more about the housing mediation and eviction prevention work specifically. And the last part, we're going to have some time to talk about questions and what you all think of that. Go ahead, the next one. So just a little bit about us. We are a community program at the city. We've been around since 1988 and providing free, confidential, voluntary conflict resolution and mediation help to people in Eastern Washington County. And in the housing mediation we're talking about, we serve all of Washington County. And we also provide restorative justice and education services, as well as conflict resolution and mediation. And then I think the last piece there is that there's 6 staff on our team, and Nadia and Michael just joining us to launch this housing mediation. And we have about 30 active volunteers who work on different programs that we offer. You can go ahead to the next one. There's our mission there, really focusing on how we can do community building to be more peaceful society. Go ahead, Nadia. So just briefly, we offer different kinds of services in our work. We have several mediation programs, 4 different mediation programs. Our community mediation, which is every kind of conflict that people might be having in their lives. That could be something related to interpersonal, neighbor to neighbor. Pretty much most of what you can think of could be community mediation. We also have our foreclosure avoidance mediation program. We serve 4 counties in Oregon that in a foreclosure avoidance, it's a state program that we participate and have mediators for. We have the housing mediation program that Nadia and Michael are going to talk about. And we partner to help rental contracts and house agreements for a couple of different programs that match homeless unaccompanied youth with home providers. And so we help support their programs with a small role that are programs outside Second Home and then Boys and Girls Aid. We partner with them for mediation work. So those are our mediation works. With facilitation, we have a restorative justice program. We have an agreement with Latino Network and the Washington County Juvenile Department, where there's been crime involving youth and a crime victim wants to meet with the youth directly. We have a program that facilitates bringing them together to work out something that can make things as right as possible through a restorative justice process. So that's our facilitation work. And then I'll just briefly say education. We teach about 30 workshops each year on conflict resolution and mediation and restorative justice. So around 30. Our next big one, which we'll mention, is our basic mediation training coming up in the end of January, which anybody that would be interested can take that. So with that, I'm gonna pass it off now. And unless I can pause briefly if there's any just burning question, and then I'll pass it on to, I can't see all the hands when we're in presentation mode, so make sure that I'll kind of try to keep an eye on the participants, but if others could help keep an eye and make sure we don't have any questions, that'd be great. I don't want to miss anybody. Let's see. Is this Michael or Nadia? This is Nadia. You're going to talk next, right? Okay, Nadia, you're on.
Yeah.
Go for it.
All right. So as Carly mentioned, one of our programs is the Housing Mediation Program. And currently part of our Housing Mediation Program is the Eviction Prevention Mediation Program, which is part of a statewide initiative to reduce evictions by providing free mediation services to renters and housing providers to help them resolve their disputes. Our goal is to prevent an eviction before it's filed, to keep people housed, to build a better connected community. So like I mentioned, it's a statewide funded project, and it's for 1 year. This year is our demonstration year. As part of our emphasis on equity, we also want with this program, we want to increase access to preventative services for underserved community members. And we're doing that by offering, again, the free mediation and conflict coaching and conciliation services, which we'll get into a little bit later, to renters and housing providers, and also collaborating with other community resource organizations that sometimes are involved in some of these housing disputes and can help us manage some of those conflicts. And just as an FYI, an eviction does not need to be filed or formally talked about to receive our services. In fact, we prefer when people call us as early as possible when they have a problem. We are one of 5 centers in the state that are receiving this funding. So there's representation in 5 different regions across Oregon, and we are able to serve Washington County, all of Washington County. All right, so what does housing mediation cover? More or less any kind of situation that involves tenant and housing provider or tenant and tenant disputes. So tenant and housing provider, that incorporates our eviction prevention mediation program that we just went over. It also, covers any other kind of like rent dispute, negotiating move out terms, issues related to repairs and maintenance, general communication issues. Sometimes folks just, have issues dealing with property management or and being able to negotiate conflicts there. Tenant and tenant conflicts are often like roommate agreements or practical living arrangements. It can also cover folks who are living together that might want to really continue their relationship and value the relationship, but they might have other conflicts in how their living styles and how they're living together. So those would also fall under housing mediation. So some of the services that we can offer in addition to formal mediation. So formal mediation is a little bit like what Carly was speaking about. Parties, usually in our case, it's 2 parties, but sometimes it's more. They have a conflict and they meet with a neutral, impartial mediator who helps facilitate a conversation or negotiation between the two parties or more parties. We also provide a service called conciliation, where the mediator will meet separately with each party, and they may go back and forth between them because they are unable to meet for whatever reason. Maybe they're unwilling to, or they simply cannot. And then there's conflict coaching, where a mediator, again, will help prepare one party who is interested in mediation, but maybe like the other party isn't interested. So then a mediator might help them just prepare to advocate for themselves, to negotiate on their own, and to help kind of strategize how that conversation can go. We thought it would be a little bit helpful if people understand a little bit about the eviction process. And I apologize because it's a lot of text, but I'll try to make it as clear as possible. Generally speaking, a tenant is served an eviction notice. And with that notice, they're given an opportunity to cure the notice. So that means they might vacate the premises, or they might pay an amount or like correct some behavior, depending on the nature of the eviction notice. If that doesn't happen, then the housing provider would file a complaint with the court. When they file a complaint with the court, there's a notice that usually goes out to the parties involved, and that will notify them of the date of their first appearance. So that's the first court date. It will also give them a notice where it'll offer mediation, and it'll say something like, consider mediation. And then it gives a little bit about our services, and it provides our information. And so usually when people contact us, it's like they've received that initial notice and they are, they've heard about us and they want to know more. Now, if the parties are unable to mediate or they are unwilling to mediate during that stage, they can go to court. And if they go to court for that first appearance date, they will again be presented with the opportunity to mediate before the actual first appearance. So if they go through mediation at the court, it's a little bit more, obviously there's a little bit more time pressure. And if they come to an agreement, it's called a stipulated agreement. And then that can be provided to the judge, and the judge will usually accept that in lieu of passing any other kind of judgment. And then alternatively, at the first appearance, the tenant has the option to file a response and to request a trial. And if they request a trial, that usually will take place about 2 weeks after that first appearance. And then Michael's going to talk a bit about the mediation process.
Okay, so mediation process. What will happen is landlord or tenant will hear about mediation in one form or another, and will come to us. We usually go over a little bit what's already happened for you, describe the process, and then if they're interested, we'll talk to them about their situation specifically. And we'll help them to explore their needs and interests and solidify their ideas about what they would want to accomplish in mediation. If they're interested still in moving forward and with their permission, because the whole process is voluntary, then we'll talk to the other party. And we have a similar discussion with that party and see what their needs and interests are. And again, if they're interested in moving forward with mediation. If they are, then, well, actually, let's back up for a second. Sometimes through this process, a party decides that, actually they're not interested in mediation, but that's not bad necessarily, because there are still other options where we can coach them on having the conversation themselves or other ways of moving forward. But then sometimes parties agree to mediate. So they'll come to the table, and the discussions can look different ways. Sometimes parties will just sit down, and after a little bit of prompting by the mediators, they'll have a direct discussion, the two of them. They just talk about their issues, and things go pretty smoothly. Sometimes people are further off on how they see things, emotions are higher, and really that's when the bigger work of the mediator comes in, where we help people to communicate clearly with each other, to clarify really what they're looking at, to help them to understand each other's issues, which can be really difficult when your emotions are high, when you're really fixed in, feeling that you haven't been heard by the other party. And so we help them have that communication. We help them to feel heard by us and feel heard by the other party. Then different things can happen. Sometimes parties just won't see eye to eye, and they're not going to make an agreement. That's the end of their mediation, and they can explore other options. Sometimes that means court, depending. Right, not always, but sometimes it means court. On the other hand, if they can come to an agreement, the mediator helps them to write out an agreement. This agreement is completely led by these parties. This is not the mediator deciding, this is how it's going to be, choosing the wording. We'll help with the wording, but this is all led by the two parties and decided on by the two parties. And I think you can go to the next slide. So There are sometimes misconceptions about mediation. To clarify, our mediation, as we said, it's free, it's voluntary, it's flexible, it's accessible, and our mediation process is fully confidential. So whatever you say to us in the beginning of the process before you actually go into a mediation, the mediation itself, that's all confidential. And that helps people to have discussions more freely and not worry about how that works. And that's especially relevant if people are worried, okay, well, this is going to go to court. Maybe I shouldn't say certain things because then it's going to be brought up into court. And no, that's not admissible in court. It was in mediation, it was confidential. So that helps have a more open and free discussion. And so I've already mentioned court, that this is an alternative to court. And what it isn't is we don't make any decisions for either of the parties. We're not an arbitrator or a judge. And sometimes people really are looking for an arbitrator or a judge. They're looking for enforcement. And that's fine, that's appropriate. And that's really, not what we're offering. And of course, as is the case with all solutions or all forms of attempted resolution, this won't solve every conflict. Sometimes people just, they can't resolve things in mediation and they move on and they find some other form of resolution, like, for example, court. Ready for the next slide? Thanks. Okay, so this, I'm going to present to you, it's a true story, but I've changed some of the details because, as I said earlier, mediation is confidential. But this is basically what happened. This was actually a fairly recent mediation that we did. And anyway, here's the story. This is the story of Jane and Maria. Jane has been Maria's tenant for roughly 10 years. And over that time, up until they had the conflict, they had a really good relationship. A little more than just a typical tenant landlord. They were quite friendly with each other, and things were good, and rent was paid on time. And then, unfortunately, on down the line, semi-recently, Jane became ill, and she was going to start having some difficulty paying a couple months' rent while she recovered. So they made an agreement just between the two of them that she wouldn't pay rent for a couple of months, and then they would split up that money and she would pay it back over a period of time. But after a little while, things fell apart. Their communication fell apart. The manner of the payment and the amount of payment became muddied. What was rent and what was actually payback and so on. Over time, it all sort of snowballed into something of a small disaster, and their communication really broke down. So when we did the intake that I've described, we talked to both parties and got a feel for each of their perspectives on it, and they both agreed they would like to mediate. So when we got into mediation in the beginning, things were they were quite far apart. There were a lot of hurt feelings because they had been friendly, and now the communication was bad, and they both took it very personally. It's a little more complicated than just bad communication, but they felt kind of ill will, and also they were very far apart, like thousands of dollars far apart on what they each believed was owed. And to the layperson coming in and looking at this, you just think, forget it. There's no way. How are these two people going to come to any resolution? It's just not possible. They should go to a judge. But that's not what happened. What happened was, over a pretty long period of time, it was actually 3 2-hour mediations. We looked at emails, and we talked about their emails, and we talked about communications and how the breakdown in communication then ended up in hurt feelings. We looked at spreadsheets and records of payments and so on. And really amazingly, they were only hundreds of dollars apart and not thousands of dollars apart. And actually, I think I'm ready for the next slide. They were able to come to an agreement. And part of this agreement is looks pretty standard, something that you might see in a court agreement, basically like the first paragraph. But then they had some other things that you wouldn't normally see in a court agreement, or maybe otherwise something you wouldn't think of. For example, there was a question about trust in how rent got passed. And so they both realized that they had this, well, it was actually Jane's neighbor, Nikos, that they both trusted and they both liked. And actually, he was one of the support people at this mediation. And so that's another thing that actually I didn't mention is another really nice thing about mediation is if agreed upon by both parties, each party can have a support person who really usually doesn't take part much in the mediation itself, but is just there as a support, an emotional support. Anyway, they decided that they were going to pass the check through Nikos. And once Nikos got the check, he says, hey, Maria, I've got the check. And that's the moment that rent is paid. And this worked great for them. And then the last thing was that they just had a brief agreement that emails would be answered promptly, basically. And they both felt good about that as well. Yeah, so a stipulated agreement. So Nadia, so what the prior agreement that I just showed you is not a stipulated agreement. That's a mediated agreement that we did, not connected to court, though it is enforceable in court. This is the document you see in front of you is a stipulated agreement. And what happens, so a stipulated agreement is once an eviction is filed, then a mediated agreement won't look the same. It's a stipulated agreement, it's connected to the court, and it's much narrower. The court requires certain things, and you can see it that you can't, basically the whole thing is that it can't extend past 6 months, and it's really monetarily focused. It's not, they're not additional things like we talked about communication in the other one, and we talked about passing the rent. Those typically would not be, or just would not be a part of a stipulated agreement. And these happen with there is court-connected mediation that happens the day of first appearance. That can happen. It's again, that's an option. And that's it. That's all I would say about stipulated agreements. I believe one of you was going to do program challenges.
I can do it. So one of the things that I mentioned a little bit earlier was, we really like if people contact us as soon as they know they have a problem. That is usually not what happens. So usually people are contacting us, when they've run out of other options or they don't know where else to turn. So they're contacting us, when they're a couple days away from their first appearance at court. That's as far as tenants are concerned. For housing providers and landlords, it's like they're often filing, before maybe considering us. So like the example that Michael gave of Jane and Maria was a very enlightened housing provider who, came to us pretty early on and was like, okay, I don't want to go to court and I want to avoid this and I want to preserve this relationship and keep this tenant. So we would like to have more housing providers like that, obviously. So those are some of the challenges. And then the other part is like, just, this is our demonstration year. This is a new program statewide. So there's a lot of just lack of awareness that we exist and that we provide this service. And so a lot of the awareness and probably a lot of the reason why people end up calling us much later in the process is because they find out about us through the court. So they find out about us through those letters, like I showed, from the court saying consider mediation when they get that first appearance notice. So we, are hoping to kind of build upon our outreach and make people more aware in the community, both tenants and housing providers, about this. And then, there are in Oregon, our program is, like we've said, is voluntary to both tenants and housing providers and anyone who's considering mediation. In other states like Washington, they actually have made it so that it's mandatory for housing providers to provide the offer of mediation before they file for eviction. And they found that that's resulted in fewer filings for eviction and keeping people housed more overall. And Carly, maybe.
Yeah, well, and the last thing here, we'll just say, so we want to stay for a few minutes for questions. So I'm sure there maybe are questions, is that I mentioned our 35-hour basic mediation training. If you'd like to find out more, we would love to have more folks. There's still space in that training, it usually fills up, but we would love to have more folks join. And that, if other ways to get involved would be helping to spread awareness about kind of the service that's available to community members. So that's the end of the PowerPoint portion. I see a hand, Lucia. And if we could close the PowerPoint and then just to have some Q&A time, that would be great.
There's also just some